G'day, Asia Mahar here again. Apologize in the last video. Whoops, I had one fan still running. It was like 104 degrees here with humidity or something, but I shall sweat. This is life. Jake, go lay down, please, bud. Up there. So, response to another comment. On the video I did, borderline personality, relationship breakups, healing codependency, and then I put H.A. Mahari's walk, so, my experience. But this person writes, if a person with BPD is emotionally unavailable, well, there's a heck of an assumption, because, okay, wait a minute. Do they not experience grief at all? Like grief from the death of a loved one, etc. If they cry, are they not being emotional and experiencing some sort of, quote, love, unquote, from their loss? My ex-boyfriend with BPD, whom I have no contact with for a month now, would cry for his adoptive parents and grieve their death from 2 years ago. But he had also told me he had attachment issues. So if that is the case, then are they, meaning people with BPD, truly experiencing grief and love? That's a bit confusing to me, says the commenter. Well, okay. First of all, people with BPD often have an inability to grieve many things, or to be able to feel and cope with feelings of pain or grief or remorse. But it's not that people with BPD are devoid of all those feelings. So I guess we'll start with the first question, the assumptive question. If people with BPD are emotionally unavailable, do they not experience grief at all? Well, people with BPD aren't exactly totally emotionally unavailable in terms of their own inner emotional experience. So they might be less emotionally available to others, but it doesn't mean there isn't a lot of emotion going on within inside of them. And again, not all people with BPD are the same. I just go with this 10 to 15% that are more severely impacted, that it might be really different for, in terms of maybe they're not feeling a lot. Maybe the diagnosis of BPD isn't exactly all they have. Wouldn't be the total answer, or total, correct diagnosis. I don't know. But I think the best way to try to explain this is that people with BPD, well, firstly, they're not all the same. Secondly, though, in childhood and with the adverse experience they really have in childhood, they start off like any other child, regardless of what's happening to them. They need parents, right? They need the parent or parents. In this case, the person says the person with BPD is grieving the death of their adoptive parents nonetheless, right? So yes, as any child, from infancy on and growing up through childhood, or, with the emotional arrested development, maybe not growing exactly up, but trying to carry on the best they can with incredible woundedness, they do want to love parents. And they do love parents because it is that love of a child in adverse conditions or invalidating and worse environments. The child loves the parent, adoptive or otherwise, because it is fused with the child's survival and the child's needs, to be, they have needs that need to be met for survival. So love, for many with BPD and the adverse childhood experiences that they have, is fused with need. But it doesn't mean that they don't care about their parents. So yes, there can be grief. It varies, but there can be grief for parents that there was some relationship with. It's different for everybody with BPD. So did maybe this person's BPDX feel, there's a lot of enmeshment that happens with people with BPD in their childhoods with parents or adoptive parents. Sometimes those relationships aren't the healthiest. But yeah, people with BPD are capable of feeling all kinds of things. And really at the heart of BPD, well, they're not usually, most people with BPD are not usually so emotionally available in any mutual, reciprocal, healthy, adult, age-appropriate, consistent, congruent way of, quote, love, unquote, in relationships, significant other and or other types of relationships in their lives. It doesn't mean they don't feel anything. In fact, they're usually feeling way too much that they don't have any coping skills for. So this renders lots of people with BPD in lots of relationship types. Usually with parent, it isn't the case, though, because they will seek after a parent where love is fused with need and it's about survival. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean that the child doesn't love the parent, but the parent also represents survival and is the one that a child looks to meet their needs and to help them grow up. So I think the fact that your ex with BPD is grieving the loss of his adoptive parents, absolutely. There's a lot of grief inside of people with BPD. Some people with BPD feel that, grieve it, and have a lot of other difficulties relating to others. And some people with BPD are different in that they may be too angry to grieve the loss of a parent or what have you. It depends on what happened, but there's no one size fits all. And just because they're really not able to be consistently or at maybe in some cases at all emotionally available for other people in what that really means in healthy relating, in congruence, and in relating to anyone else, significant other or otherwise, any other relationship type relating to the actual person versus object other, from the unconscious through seeing the person that way and not knowing it. People with BPD, most people with BPD feel way too much. It's unbridled, unregulated, overwhelming emotion with so many moving components to it. They don't understand why, and they don't have the coping skills or ability to deal with that. So, yes, people with BPD grieve the loss of parents. They grieve the loss of many things, and they might do it in their own ways, and it might not be everybody, but many, many people, or most with BPD. I think back to when I had BPD, going back to my childhood at the age of 7 when my grandmother died, and I didn't even understand what that meant, and then how the family of origin dealt with that, and nobody, spoke about her again, and I was, that was very painful to me. I cared very, very much about my grandmother, and she was somebody that was actually kind to me, like most of the family of origin, and she died when I was 7, and then long story short on that, just to give an example, it wasn't until I was in university and taking a course that was called On Death and Dying, in which the preponderance of the mark went not only to an exam, but the other, the kind of like 50% of a mark. In that course on Death and Dying that I was in many moons ago now, was an essay, that major essay project that we had to do, wherein we had to take an example from our lives of loss and then, in many ways fulfill what we were learning in the course and, have that be a part of the essay. And I'm not bragging here, but I got 100% on it because that's how much grief. The course was on death and dying, and it was all about grief and processing grief. And so even back when I had BPD, which is when I wrote this essay, and I was in therapy, and I got in touch with, I was in my 20s, I got in touch with the pain that had to be repressed when I was 7, when my grandmother actually died, because nobody would ever speak about her again. It's like, for them, it was out of sight, out of mind, and that never worked for me. So I grieved deeply while I had BPD, my grandmother. It's just one example. And there were other losses too. And a grandfather and, an uncle I didn't really like. But like, I grieved an uncle by marriage. But I grieved that too. So because people with BPD can't really be emotionally congruent in a mature and adult age-appropriate way with others until unless a lot of significant treatment to almost healed and recovered, which is so possible. It doesn't mean they don't feel, like they feel tons, and it doesn't mean that they don't grieve or experience loss. So I just thought I'd insert that example as an example. And was I can't really compare myself to people with BPD today because it was just very different. And I still have to do the video series on what I really now understand about my life in terms of BPD and what recent studies just this past year outside of American Pseudoscience of Psychiatry have actually proven and explained my experience in a much better way. But anyway, I don't know what the implications of that are, and it is revisionist history. So I'm going to leave that as a project separate from the channel. But I hope to get that done soon. And so the person said if they cry, are they not being emotional and experiencing some sort of, quote, love, unquote? Well, they're being emotional, yes. They're not narcissists, okay? They're being emotional, and lots of people with BPD cry about lots of things. And may prefer to do it alone, than with others, but they're all different. Yes, they're being emotional when they're crying, and yes, they're experiencing loss. And if it involves love, which in the example I gave about my grandmother when she passed when I was 7, the feelings were pretty suspended in me. I felt something. I missed her, but the family of origin around me was modeling don't feel. The injunctions in my family were don't feel, don't talk about feelings, the don't talk rule. So in that regard, do I feel like I loved that grandmother? Closest thing to it. As much as I was capable of that back then, I also felt like I loved my parents when I was a kid because I needed my parents. I don't think I loved much about how they treated me, but they were the ones that I needed for survival. So, again, the love that might be felt for, the loss of adoptive parents, or what I gave the example of my grandmother, which was my mother's mother, who probably was a quiet borderline also. Just given my mother's experience and how she ended up in her life and how I experienced my grandmother as a very quiet person, but sometimes was very, would play with me in silly little ways, and they were gentle ways. So anyway, yes, people with BPD have emotions, tons of them. They can feel grief. They can feel loss. They can cry about it, and not all people with BPD are the same. But that doesn't mean that, quote, love, unquote, or measure or amount, or love fused with need, love and loss, with a lot of accrued loss in the lives of people with BPD. It doesn't say anything about them being emotionally available or able to love in any healthy, congruent, consistent, adult, mutual, or reciprocal way in relationships in adulthood until and unless significant treatment. And the other thing was, and that this person's ex with BPD said that they have attachment issues. Yes, well, I dealt with that in the last video. Borderline personality is largely looked at as disorganized attachment, which I think is a fancy way of saying non-existent attachment. Severely unhealthy attachment, but not really attachment. So that's the best I can do with that. Hope it's not too confusing. And then he said, so if he had attachment, because he said he had attachment issues, if that's the case, and I'm sure it is the case, and especially being adopted and having BPD, so if that is the case, okay, that he has attachment issues, and then is he truly, and you go, are they, instead of asking about one person that you know, are they experiencing grief and love? Well, they're experiencing grief. And as I said before, that's often love fused with need, which continues to play out in the patterns of the unhealthy ways that people with BPD can't take in your love and can't express healthy, adult, mutual, reciprocal, age-appropriate, quote, love, unquote, because they have arrested emotional selves and arrested emotional development, which can be, I'd like to underscore, and like some information out there, can be healed. It can be healed. And nothing is hardwired in the brain of people with BPD. And to the impact of abandonment and woundedness on the brain, neuroplasticity in any psychotherapy can address that. If people with BPD will just go to therapy and stick with the process and engage the treatment. And so this commenter seems so confused that people with BPD can feel, that people with BPD can grieve. People with BPD are full of grief, full of feeling, full of woundedness, but it's not what they're feeling there and what they're grieving about. And yes, they have the emotional capacity for this, but it doesn't translate out into accepting your love in a relationship or being able to give love back in a relationship. And I just think it's really telltale sign of the stigma out there that you said if a person with BPD is emotionally unavailable, so that's assumptive that they all are, and therefore they can't feel grief. They protect against that when they ghost people, They protect against that when they try to have relationships with others, however the relationship ruptures or the breakup occurs. They defend against that, but they might not be as defended against when adoptive parents or in my case, when I was 7, when my grandmother died. It can be very different and multifaceted in different people with BPD. And so somehow I think, from your comment, and I could be wrong, seems like you think that people with BPD are emotionally unavailable, therefore they feel nothing, and they're what, like narcissists? Because that's not true. So they feel very, very much. Whether or not they can express it to other people all the time, that's a whole other thing. And the other thing, I guess, to go over one more time here is, so the commenter thought because the person with BPD said they had attachment issues, which is absolutely true, that then they, so how could they really be experiencing grief or love? Love is fused with need in childhood, for people with BPD especially. And it's different than when they try to relate, because it's the child to the parent, or in my case, it was me as a child about my grandmother, and I had a capacity to feel and a capacity for empathy, and it could get suspended at times when I had BPD, but it wouldn't speak to how I would relate to others when I had BPD either, whether I was sometimes emotionally available and other times not, because it's all about when people with BPD are triggered and the arrested emotional development and the degree to which they really fit the diagnosis of this label of BPD. So I think there's a lot of supposition and assumptiveness in your comment, which I don't mean any disrespect to you about, but maybe it will help others too, because people with BPD, just because they might not be emotionally available and they can't love and they can't accept love in relationships, more of them than not, until and unless significantly treated, doesn't mean they haven't had love for a parent, like I said, that gets fused with need. But many people with BPD can have different kind of parents too. And or like what I explained about how I felt about my grandmother and how I missed her and how it wasn't safe or okay in my family of origin to talk about it or to feel about it. And I remember feeling things about other relatives that passed away when I was a kid, but I wasn't allowed to talk about it, so I would have to quickly kind of like dissociate from it. And that happens for a lot of people with BPD too. But please understand, people with BPD, for as impossible as it can be to try to have relationships with them, especially when they're untreated, etc., they have a world of hurt going on inside, and many deal with it in different ways, but many have way, way, way too much emotion, which can get in the way of, and they don't know how to attach, and they do have attachment issues, or, they might not have had any attachment whatsoever with a parent. So one thing, and the truth about the way people with BPD relate more often than not in adulthood, it doesn't apply the same in childhood. And so, yes, people with BPD can be grieving the loss of a parent, or like in my case, the example, my grandmother, who I still miss to this day. And yes, I'll go out on a limb and say I feel like she's a guardian angel of mine for sure. So, this idea that people, because of all the troubles that people with BPD do have with relating and relationships, serious issues that they could go and deal with and heal and work through in long-term therapy, but not in time to save a relationship that's current right now or been, on and off forever, in no way means that people with BPD don't grieve or feel. They protect against it with relationship breakups more often than not in adulthood, but they're not hollow. They're not narcissists, and every person with BPD is different. But I stand by what I say about most people with BPD until unless significant treatment or more, really don't know how to accept your love, really don't feel love, really don't love you because they aren't relating to you, because they're relating to you as object, other, parent representation on an unconscious level. They're looking for the reparation of what they didn't get in childhood from a parent or parents, just as codependents on the other side of the equation are also looking for reparation for woundedness from their childhood, different than that of those with BPD. But that's what all the overextending and all the overgiving and all the people-pleasing and all the rescuing is about. So I hope people will keep remembering that people with BPD are not narcissists. Hope that was helpful to someone. Take care.